But could you be somewhat to blame for this, and President Bush be somewhat to blame for this, in the endless talk about the war on terror? It was almost like a recruiting sergeant for Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, wasn't it? Because there were these group of people who were the people who were seen, maybe who became attracted to this ideology, who felt, actually, if you're going to stand up for the West, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda are the people to do it.
Right, and I think the answer to that, because I think this is absolutely the nub of why we've still got to beat this thing, is that when we say, well, the West went in and imposed its system on Afghanistan and Iraq, we've already conceded a huge amount to the narrative they've got. The truth is that's not what we did. We knocked out the Taliban. We then had a United Nations convened process, and then we said to the country, you decide in an election who you want to vote for. Ditto with Iraq. First thing we did in Iraq was we got all the different groups together. We had a Iraqi governing council. We brought the United Nations back into the situation. They then bombed the United Nations out. And the one thing that I think is still very, very important for us is not to fall for this notion that somehow by removing a brutal dictatorship and giving people a UN-led process with democratic rights, we are somehow conducting a war of the West against Islam. I mean, it's absurd. It's, you know, so the point is, until you challenge the fundamental nature of that narrative, you leave them in the situation where, yes, they can recruit, because we are appearing to say, well, yeah, we kind of understand why you feel like that.
But would you also accept then that there was a naivety in the sort of maybe the liberal interventionist speech that you made in Chicago, you know, where you talked about the right to intervene and to kind of, you know, the preemptive war almost as being the least worst option, that you thought that you could impose democracy almost on these places, and actually it's more complicated than that?
Here's where I agree with him and where I disagree. Where I agree is, when I look back now, my knowledge of this problem, I think, is a lot deeper today than it was then. However, when you say, well, what's the consequence of that? You see, we didn't impose democracy. The people could have come out in Afghanistan and decided they wanted the Taliban. And they didn't. You know, and whatever work anyone does in Iraq or Afghanistan, the one thing for sure is that the people there preferred the chance to elect their government. So when there were those by terrorism trying to destabilize that, my point is, you've got to stand up to those people, not say, oh, okay, well then maybe we should just have left the Taliban in charge.
Okay, so you don't need the Taliban in charge, but maybe what we've seen now with what has been unfolding with the Arab Spring is that this is not something that has come from the West, that has come from NATO. You look at what's happened in Tunisia, you looked at what's happened in Egypt, you look at what is happening with still a great deal of uncertainty in Syria. That has come from the people.
Yeah, that's great. But what's the lesson of Afghanistan, Iraq, Arab Spring? The people actually want freedom and democracy if they're able to choose it. And, you know, what we did in Libya, which I think was absolutely right, is...
But there was an uprising that had started, and there were civilians that were being killed, and therefore that is when the UN came to be involved. It wasn't a sort of preemptive thing as it was in Iraq.
No, although one thing that I think has to be pointed out here, it's not that people in Iraq didn't try and rise up, by the way. They did. In fact, they tried to rise up in the early 1990s and were slaughtered.
And were abandoned by the West.
Were abandoned by the West. So, you know, what I find bizarre is when people say to me, well, we got rid of that terrible man Gaddafi in Libya, but by the way, it was wrong to get rid of Saddam. So I think look, in the end, what the Arab Spring shows is that this desire of people for you know, freedom. Why wouldn't you want freedom to choose your government rather than have it imposed on you is very deep, and it's not a Western value. Now, I also think, however, that in the action in Libya, we're able to learn from the experiences, particularly in nation building in Afghanistan and Iraq. But we've also got to hope, by the way, that in Libya you don't get the same external forces as you got in Iraq, particularly, and in Afghanistan, destabilizing the situation. Now, personally, I am pretty optimistic about that. I think there's every chance Libya will get on its feet. And that would be great. And it would also give, by the way, a lot of hope to other people in the region.
Do you think that the consequences of Libya, if just let's assume you're right, and that the outlook is quite bright, and I'm sure there's going to be trouble along the way to a path towards sort of nation building and all the rest of it, and civil society returning, do you think that has consequences for the rest of the region?
Yes, I do. Although I think the single most important country in the region from that perspective is what happens in Egypt. So I think that's where we need to put a lot of effort, a lot of work, and a lot of support.
What happens? Is it acceptable to the West if they, the Egyptian people might go out and vote for the Muslim Brotherhood? Is that fine?
Well, in democracy they're entitled to vote for whoever they want to vote for. I think what is important
But you've been arguing that maybe these elections ought to be delayed, i.e. to give other opposition parties more of a chance. So, please delay your vote until such times as you're ready not to vote for the Muslim Brotherhood.
Well, I think you're reasonable enough to say, where you've got a situation where there are no functioning political parties and you want a genuine democratic expression, you're right to give time for parties to organise themselves. In the end, you've got to accept the will of the people. But I think we've also got to be very clear, and I think this is very important for the West to emphasise in relation to the Arab Spring. Because I find this when I'm out in the region. Look, when my latest visit to Israel is my 70th time in the region in the last 4 years, so I've got a reasonable understanding of what's going on there. I think it's really important people understand democracy is not just about the freedom to vote in and out your government. It's about freedom of expression, free media, it's about freedom of religion, it's about open markets, it's about the rule of law, it's about a whole set of attitudes and institutions, not just a simple you vote in your government or you don't.
Do you think that could happen in Syria?
I think it can, I think it should, and I think we should do everything we can now to encourage change to come in Syria, because I think it's obvious that Assad is not going to lead the change that is necessary.
Do you think Assad can stay on leading the country?
No, not credibly or legitimately.
There are dictators, though, who may not have been credible but have managed to stay in power an awful long time.
No, sure, that's true, but I think what's happening now is that, actually I think across the world, I don't think this is related just to the Arab Spring, I think it's partly to do, in fact, with the way the world works today and the way it communicates, social media, an emerging middle class. I think that evolution is preferable to revolution, but there are countries in which you don't get that choice. So, again, in my view, if in Libya, for example, Gaddafi right at the very outset had said, look, I accept now the will of the people is that there is change, let's try and work together to get a process of change, I'm not going to turn my guns on the people, instead what I'm going to do is engage with a process of change even though you don't agree with what I've done in the last years. Look, you would be sensible to have accepted that offer. Same with Assad. I mean, I hoped even until a short time ago that Assad in Syria would have the sense, because he's not an unintelligent man, actually quite well connected with the West, have the sense to realise that he had to lead a process of change in which he would give up power. But the trouble is some of these people just don't want to do that.
But when 9/11 happened, it looked, I don't hate the jargon, it looked like it was a unipolar world. There was one superpower, it was the United States of America. Yeah. Their writ would run. And they used all their weaponry and with the assistance of Britain, and it didn't change the world. It didn't make people cower. It hasn't made Assad or any of these other dictators think, I've got to fall into line now.
Well, first of all, that's not really why we did what we did. I mean, we did it because following 9/11, the calculus of risk had changed, and we had to act against this terrorist threat. And in its different dimensions. But on the other hand, if you think about what America or Britain represents and the values that we represent, I think you'd have to say they're in the ascendancy in a curious way. So yes, it's true in terms of hard power. The limits of hard power are clear. But in terms of soft power, what we stand for, actually most people are buying into that way of life rather than not.
But Mr. Blair, don't you think that most people listening to this will think that what you represented, what George W. Bush represented, was the use of hard power?
Yeah, but it wasn't only that, and that's really important to understand, because we didn't, what we could have done was have said in relation to Afghanistan or Iraq, provided we make it safe from terrorists, then that's our job done, then we're off out of there. We didn't. We actually said, look, the only safety in the end comes from a system of government that can be chosen by the people. And by the way, the only way we will resolve the problems in the Middle East today is through the spread of democracy.
So where is the battle of ideas now? 10 years on, where would you say that the world is a safer place?
Well, I think it is safer in this sense. I think we are winning the battle of ideas. I mean, I'm actually optimistic that the open-minded will win over the closed-minded. I also think we've learned a lot as to how to deal with this terrorist threat in security terms. I think we've learned a lot about nation building, as you can see with what we're going to try and do in Libya now. On the other hand, I think we've got to understand the struggle is still there, because this view is still there, and it's not just about terrorism. It's not just about Al-Qaeda. The truth of the matter is, if you look at some of the elements of, say, the Muslim Brotherhood out in the Middle East, they don't want the same as us. I mean, they want a very, very different world. And what's more, they're prepared to fight to get it. So, that struggle, I fear, is still there. If you look at what's happened in Pakistan, see, to me, what is worrying about Pakistan is not whether the security services are really cooperating or not. I think the Pakistani government's doing what it can, actually. The thing that troubles me is when the governor of the Punjab is assassinated for having an open-minded view on religion, and 250,000 people come out in the street in support of his killers. That's what worries me. So I think we've still got a long way to go, I'm afraid. And what I think now, as opposed to at 9/11, is I think this is a generation-long struggle. It's got many different dimensions. I think it's global. And I think we've learned a lot in the 10 years as to how best to deal with it and how not.
That will require the use of soft power in the future and hard power?
Yes, I think it will be a combination of the two, because I think they have to know that if they're fighting us, we're prepared to stand up and fight. But in the end, the answer to it is a better idea. I mean, in that way, it's very reminiscent to me of kind of revolutionary communism. In other words, we defeated it by being prepared to protect ourselves and defend ourselves, but in the end, what made it crumble was a better idea than their idea.
Tony Blair, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Ten years after September 11th. How has the world changed?
Are we safe? I don't think so.
Understand what the threat